Well, for more on the World Bank's Poverty and Shared Prosperity report, I spoke to Francisco Ferreira. He's a senior advisor from the World Bank's Development Research Group. So I asked him why extreme poverty rates have fallen in recent years.
The first piece of good news is that there's a lot of progress in reducing poverty, actually, that we've seen in the last 23 to 25 years. Since 1990, we've seen a decline in poverty of over 1 billion people leaving extreme poverty. That is, conditions where you're living under $1.90 a day per person. Even in the last period, for which we have numbers, 2012 to 2013, there was a decline of 100 million people. Now, the second part, the not so good news, is that as we project that forward towards 2030, which is the deadline for our goals here of ending extreme poverty in the Sustainable Development Goals and the World Bank's own goals on that, then we see that actually, despite this good recent progress, because the poverty that's left is in places that are harder to reach. They're in Africa, they're in fragile states, they're in places that are not growing as fast as China, Indonesia, and India, who have been driving the poverty reduction so far. Actually, it will be harder to get to those goals. Growth alone, without changes in inequality, will not get us to 3% by 2030.
Now, you mentioned a couple of countries that you said are really making great strides in this arena. What is it that they're doing right?
Well, China and Indonesia, for example, and India as well, are countries that have, first of all, had a lot of economic growth, just a lot of economic growth in rural areas, also in urban areas, jobs, wages rising. This is, of course, the main driver of poverty reduction. In Indonesia, there's also been progress in changing some of the social policies, reducing some inefficient subsidies, and promoting other kinds of social policies that reach poor people more effectively. There are other examples we look at in the report, countries in Latin America, Brazil and Peru, countries in Africa like Mali and Tanzania. We look at Cambodia as well. So these are all countries that have done it in different ways. There is no single one-size-fits-all prescription for reducing inequality. Each of these countries has done it in a slightly different way. It typically involves a stable macroeconomy, a well-functioning labor market with people getting jobs and getting paid for those jobs, and some social policies that help the poorest and most vulnerable have a step up to reach the ladder.
Let's also look at innovation and technology. What role are they playing in how we can tackle extreme poverty?
Well, there's all kinds of ways in which innovation and technology play a big role. I mean, if you look at China, for example, the country that has reduced poverty the most in absolute terms, in terms of absolute numbers of people. There's been, of course, enormous industrial and manufacturing growth in China over the last 2 decades, which has been built upon, to a large extent, innovation and technology. There's also innovation and technology in other domains. For example, one way of bringing, we talk in the report about rural electrification and the importance of bringing electricity to the hundreds of millions of people who don't have access to it, say, in sub-Saharan Africa. So, without electricity, kids can't read at night. Small businesses find it hard to function. Women are cooking with fuels that are often bad for their health instead of using electricity or other fuels, right?
In this current situation, we're looking at some very sluggish global growth. So with that in mind, are you still as optimistic about reaching that goal in 2030, given the current economic climate?
Well, actually, your question is what prompted the bit of not such good news that I mentioned in my first answer, right? So actually, we are not super optimistic about meeting that first target. What we say in the report is that unless we tackle inequality, unless we make the poor grow faster, unless we change the income distribution so that inequality is less, even relatively optimistic growth scenarios like the ones of the last decade are not going to lead us to meet the goal. So, this is a nuance, which I try to convey in my first answer, but it's important. The report has good news about the past. It's not naively optimistic about the future at all. In fact, we say that current estimates of growth with no changes in inequality will lead us to not meeting the 3% by 2030 goal. That's why it's so important to invest in the poorest, to promote shared prosperity and the growth of the bottom, is because without that, we won't meet the goal. Inequality reduction is, in other words, essential for meeting the poverty goal.